This is a review of Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey, the Authorized Biography. The book came out in 2006 and so covers all of his films up to King Kong. The great thing about this book is that it is authorized and on a living filmmaker, which is something that is very rare. Usually books on directors are written unofficially or posthumously, whereas with this book you can really feel Peter Jackson's involvement. Every other page there'll be, a paragraph or two of direct commentary from him. And the result is this really great mix of sort of feeling like a hybrid of biography and autobiography. So it's great that he has clearly given a lot of time to help Brian Sibley, the author, create this book. Brian Sibley has done a couple of books on the making of the Lord of the Rings movies, and in addition to these long interviews with Peter Jackson, he's really done his good hitting the pavement journalism and interviewed just, dozens and dozens of people who have worked with Peter throughout his life. So he's not just regurgitating information or quotes from other sources, which goes a long way to making this book feel like it has real value, especially for Lord of the Rings. I mean, there are a few stories and things that you will have heard before, but I really was surprised and delighted by Brian Sibley's efforts to present as much new information without sort of rehashing a whole lot of things that I'd already read or heard. Brian Sibley and these other people he's interviewed do tend to be a little bit fawning, or like they're, patting their mate on the back. There does feel like there's a lot of, oh, Peter Jackson's so amazing, he's so talented, he's such a genius, and he always has been. And even though that does get a little bit tired sometimes, overall I think Brian Sibley has really presented a well-written, frank view of Peter Jackson's life. Additionally, there are tons and tons of photos throughout, which is really nice. They are all black and white except for two color sections. The unfortunate thing is, as books like this do tend to be, the reproductions of the black and white photos are not the best, but despite that they still do add enormously to the engagement of the book, and I really liked having them as part of the book. So I think the most important thing with reviewing this book is assessing who is it for and who's going to get the most out of it, because I don't necessarily think there are people who are fans of Peter Jackson the man in the same way that there are fans of singers or actors. I doubt there are people who have a picture of Peter Jackson on their wall and wonder what he's doing and what he's thinking and want to read this book to get all the juicy secrets of his life. Instead, I think most people are probably going to be interested in specifically his work and his creative endeavors, in which case this book fills that requirement amazingly. This book is really more of an overview of the development of his movies. As a biography, it's more about the movies than the man. There's really very little about his personal life. Even when his kids are born, that only merits like half a sentence, and even then the other half of the sentence is tying that into whatever movie they're making at the time. And I mention this because some people might like that sort of stuff or be expecting it from a biography, but personally I much prefer this approach where his work and who he is as a filmmaker is the main focus. Everything is just movies, 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 and so this book really lives up to the subtitle of A Filmmaker's Journey, and that makes for a really strong and engaging, focused read, because you are never reading about any sort of boring periods of his life that are unrelated to filmmaking, like with the exception of the very start where it talks about his parents before he was born. But after that, the book is entirely about him as a filmmaker, and I think that's really great. It means that the book is very focused, and it never detours from the reason that you would be coming to this book. And so from that point of view, I think the people who are going to get the most out of this book are, if you are someone who is sort of interested in the film industry in a more general way, if you are someone who is just very movie obsessed, very interested in the film industry, then this is really fantastic, especially because it's an atypical journey for a director's career. And similarly, if you're an amateur filmmaker or you're in film school or something, then this book would be amazingly inspirational. Even if you're not especially interested in Peter Jackson's films, this book would still be such great inspiration, just because there are so few biographies on directors with this much involvement from the filmmaker, giving you a real great insight into especially those early years of his filmmaking getting off the ground. Because the thing is, Peter Jackson wasn't born rich. He didn't have, he wasn't unrealistically lucky. He didn't go to film school. He didn't have to move to LA and, pay his dues working up the Hollywood hierarchy. And he grew up and lived and made these films on the arse end of the world, pre-internet, and has been able to establish his own filmmaking empire down there, and as a result become one of the top directors in the world. And so I think for people with aspirations of becoming filmmakers, it's incredibly inspiring, because it's really a story of, well, if he can do it, you can too. The other group of people who might be interested in this book are the Lord of the Rings fans, which is the reason I came to the book, although I am obviously very interested in filmmaking in a general sense, but I wouldn't have bought this book if it weren't for Lord of the Rings. But assessing if this book is good enough just for the Lord of the Rings information, which is very good information, especially my absolute favorite part of this book was the period between Peter Jackson waking up one day and wondering who owns the film rights to the Lord of the Rings, and up to the actual green lighting of the movie, and hasn't really been explored a whole lot, even in the extended edition appendices and any other books. I really enjoy reading about all of the film industry politics and struggles of getting a project off the ground, the stuff that goes on before the actual filmmaking, before pre-production even, which is something you hear very little about in regular making of books. And even though The Lord of the Rings does make up a significant part of his life and a significant part of this book, I would say it's probably about 25% Lord of the Rings. You've really got to ask yourself, is that worth investing money or time in this, quite a hefty book, if 75% of what you're reading is not related to what you're specifically interested in? Really, it just comes down to how fanatical you are. If you are the biggest Lord of the Rings fan and you really relish those extra details that you're going to get from this book, then, I guess so. But if you're only, kind of a big fan of the movies, I'm not necessarily sure there's going to be enough here to warrant the investment of your time and money. You'll probably just be happy sticking with the appendices or some of the other Lord of the Rings related books. I think you've got to want more than just Lord of the Rings from this book. But like I said, I came to this book for Lord of the Rings, but ended up staying for the whole thing. I've read this book 3 times now, and I immensely enjoy reading about his whole filmmaking journey every time, even for his movies that I haven't seen. And if you haven't seen all of his movies, don't let that deter you from reading the book. I don't think you'll have any trouble keeping up with what's going on or understanding what's going on. Although I also really like Peter Jackson's King Kong, but that was the shortest and consequently weakest chapter in this book. I don't usually read biographies about specific people when it comes to films, but books like this show me that maybe I really should, because the level of insight and depth you get really can't be matched in a book that is about the making of a whole film, because with these biographies you are following the journey of one man. You're getting a director's eye point of view, as opposed to a regular making of book, which tries to cover every aspect of the film from a bird's eye view. And I've mentioned in previous reviews of his books that Brian Sibley is really great at giving you the human perspective of how these movies are made, because that's how these movies are made. They're not made by magical elves in Hollywood. They're made by everyday people in the filmmaking trenches. And I think Brian Sibley's ability to capture that is shown really well in this book, without needing to be, overly emotional or dramatic. So even though the book came out quite a while ago, the first in hardcover and then this paperback edition we're looking at now, it actually went into another reprint just last month. So it's still very easy to get your hands on. There's also a Kindle edition. One thing people might be wondering about is how this book compares to another Peter Jackson book that came out last year called Anything You Can Imagine. So if you're wondering about that book, definitely make sure you're subscribed, because we will be taking a look at that book in a couple of weeks.